good afternoon, and happy Friday. My name is Catherine Baker, and I'm going to be hosting this afternoon's WebEx about lessons that we can learn from the Lions. Today with me, I have two very important men. I have David Soul, who was a 1989 British Lion, British and Irish Lion himself. And I also have Guy Richardson on the line with me, who was a Lions Tour logistics manager in 2009 and the director of operations for the Lions in 2013. So both of them are going to be talking about this from two different perspectives, one from the lens of a player, while the other from the lens of administrator. They both lived through what the Lions have been going through over the last few games. They've been in that scrutiny. They've had to make a tough decision and stand by them. They've had to show great leadership. They've had to work within a team to reach that goal, to reach that common final thing that they wanted to accomplish and kind of forgive each other and work together. They've also had to create a culture that enables them to do all that, to work as a team. So today they're here to tell us what they've learned from the Lions, from their own experiences, but also from the recent things that we've seen the Lions doing. The Lions have shown exemplary leadership. They've shown great teamwork, and they've managed to create a culture where they all work together and put each other first. So David and Guy have gone on to run both two very successful businesses in their own right, and I'm sure some of the things that have made them so successful are the things that they've learned while working with or playing for the Lions. So without further ado, I am really looking forward to hearing more about this. Remember, everybody, you can send a chat to me with any questions about the program, and I'd be happy to ask those questions to David and Guy as they take breaks. But without any more, David and Guy, over to you guys.
Catherine, thank you very much indeed. And for all those who are fortunate or unfortunate enough to see us on a screen, I just want to let you know that we did not consult on our shirts, which are too similar for my liking, if I'm being honest. So there you have it. David, how are you?
I'm very well, thanks, Guy, and thanks very much for joining us.
No, delighted to be here. Thanks for having me along.
We talked a little bit about the subject matter, and I think the first one for me is the leadership of this Lions tour, and I was not convinced that there was an outstanding leader from the Six Nations who would be the tour captain. And for me, it was always about the tour captain being the captain who would lead the side out onto the first test.
Yeah.
And so it was really interesting, I think, that Peter O'Mahony was selected as captain for that first test, with the tour captain, Sam Warburton, being in the background and not featuring and leading his side out. Do you think that was something that Gatland had pre-planned, or do you think that he took the decision based on how good O'Mahony was in the run-up to that tour?
I think there's two things to this. One, I think that Warren would have selected one of his trusted lieutenants. So, you know, there's so much pressure to deliver. The hardest thing about the Lions Tour, as we know, is getting people to come together very quickly to start performing at the best they can do. And he's already seen Sam Warburton deliver that in spades in 2013. And of course, he has a very good relationship and he's a trusted lieutenant. So a bit like business, you know, if you come into a new environment, you know, you want your trusted men around you. And of course, we've then got the second aspect, and that is form. So I think he wanted Sam on the tour. I think he wanted Sam to be captain. But, you know, he made the big call. He was prepared to go, do you know what? Sam is on the tour, but he's not playing well enough to merit tour captaincy. And I think that's a very bold decision. I think there's people out there who, and I know there's a mixed view on it, whether or not you select someone as tour captain or someone who's an absolute shoo-in. But they have a man, a leader, who twice now has been on Lions tours, and you know the jury's out whether or not you deem a level series a success or not. But I think, you know, through making some really big calls early on where perhaps others wouldn't have done, we've seen some real progress.
Yeah, it's interesting when he made that big call in making O'Mahony the captain for the first test, and of course he went from hero to zero, so because he didn't feature in any of the either test squads, which in itself was a big decision by Gatland.
It is a big decision, yeah.
But I think one of the other things that really shone through for me, particularly on this tour, was leadership is a team sport now, and the teams or the leaders that emerged through that tour. Mario Itoje, I think, was outstanding and was given a big responsibility in the second test to lead the line-out. Other people, ahead of Alan Wynne-Jones. And other really significant leaders, Owen Farrell, Johnny Sexton, that came into the second test. It was much more informal in my day. I mean, we had some great players in '89 and indeed in 1990 in the Scottish side that I was fortunate enough to lead, where that leadership responsibility was shared around, like Finlay Calder, John Jeffrey, Gavin Hastings in the Lions. We had Brian Moore, Mike Teague, Dean Richards, superb players, great leaders in their own right. But it's much more formalised now, isn't it, in the modern Lions environment?
My answer to that is yes and no. I think, you're sitting there, but you won your tour, and I think, if you look at the landscape that is sport, it is ridden with carcasses of teams that have lost disappointingly for whatever reason. Conversely, if you look at the landscape, you go, there's been some massively successful teams out there, both in the amateur era and in the professional era, and why is that? And I think the golden thread through all of this is the fact there's been the 5 or 6 leaders. And it's like, again, turning back to business, you've got your person at the top, but they are supported with this wonderful team of lieutenants who are all very clear on what the purpose is. They're all pointing in the same direction and all playing their part. And I think that was certainly what I saw firsthand in 2013. I mean, how lucky was Sam, to have Brian O'Driscoll and Paul O'Connell, 2 previous Lions Tour captains, at his side. And I watched regularly the 3 of them having conversations over a cup of coffee. How good was that? So with that background, you then have Sam going into this tour, and of course, as you say, you've got the likes of all these other leaders who came on the tour as well. I'm delighted, and worth noting, and for all those viewers out there who see us, worth noting, of course, that we have the captain of Scotland who made an appearance, which we're all delighted about. Yeah,
I mean, I think that is one particularly pertinent point. I think when you think about translations from sport into business, this fact that leadership is a team sport, and one of the challenges, I think, of a great leader in the business environment is to select the best possible team around him and make sure that those people around him are absolutely on point and the best possible people that he can afford, and also who fit into that environment. And I think one of the big challenges of that Lions tour was the amount of pressure that Warren Gatland came out of him of that tour. If we flip to the next slide, we'll see the picture of him being ridiculed in the New Zealand press as a clown. But he wasn't afraid to make the big calls in that tour. But also he ran the risk of upsetting the whole team dynamic, I think, when he selected the Welsh players who happened to be in New Zealand. But your view is that was, again, a pre-planned move?
I have no doubt about that, and now's maybe not the place to talk about whether or not that was good for the value of the Lions as a brand, that word. But I think I have no doubt that I don't think it's circumstantial, the fact that Wales were playing in Australia at the time of the Lions tour. Sorry, in New Zealand. I just don't think that was circumstantial. Having been lucky enough to have worked with Warren, who I put right up there in terms of the coaches I've worked with. He is a big strategist, and he looks way ahead. And I know that there would have been conversations early on. And I think also, yes, there was an impact, but I think every player who was on that tour and selected, albeit 41, and rightly so, there'll be people out there thinking, well, that's a ridiculous number to take on a tour, but that's what he took. And I think all those players would have been very early on, would be well aware, for the good of the tour and the purpose of the tour, which is very clear, to win the Test series, and in order to protect some of those midweek players who would then be on the bench potentially for the Test, that some players were going to come in. And of course, Warren did it to some success on the last tour, where he brought in 2 people. And I remember in the middle of the night being woken up and told to get a player in within 6 hours. So that was possibly not pre-planned on the last tour, but it certainly was on this tour. And I think by having all that preparation and people knowing it's going to happen, just alleviated what you're rightly thinking could have been real problems ordinarily.
Yeah, and perhaps that was a lesson learned from Australia to New Zealand.
Yes, I think so.
To prepare in that way. I mean, my view on that was, culture is so important in the Lions, and undoubtedly being selected for the Lions is the pinnacle of a rugby player's career if you come from England, Ireland, Scotland or Wales, because you are perceived to be the best of the best.
Yes.
You are first amongst a group of equals. And I guess my concern about this particular call that he made,
yes.
And again, a very big call, was that it might undermine the culture.
Yes.
And if you offer the opportunity to be part of the best, and you're a second or third tier player, in reality, are you really upholding the values and the culture
yes.
of the British and Irish Lions, which is so strong and so important? And I think in the event, they managed it very well, because the potential for it to fragment was far greater, I think, having brought these players in. But it didn't seem to happen. No,
it didn't seem to happen, and I absolutely, to be clear, I do not, I very much agree with you on that. But I think it showed the strength of the culture there, and I know we're going to be touching on elements of culture later, but it just shows you the power of that particular culture. Would they have got away with it in other circumstances and other teams? I don't think so, if I'm being brutally honest. And of course also, had those individuals got on, they know, I mean, you talk from a player perspective, but they of course know that they're not the best of the best. So they're probably sitting there thinking, do you know what, I don't particularly, not sure I want to get on here. But there you have it, that's for them to talk about.
Well, it's interesting, I guess, had I been in Gatland's place and I'd wanted that cover, and I didn't want to expose my test players to unnecessary rugby, with a group of 41 players, you've got enough coverage in that to do that.
Yeah, sure.
I guess that's why he's the coach and we're possibly...
And we're sitting here.
Exactly that.
That's it.
But one of the other things, I think, and again, as we move on to the next slide, one of the other things I think about leadership is making the tough calls, and particularly when you're under pressure. He has a reputation, seemingly now, for making really difficult calls, and there's a couple of screen grabs there. Brian O'Driscoll, back in 2013, he doesn't shy away from that, and that for me showed incredibly strong leadership in 2013, and he made some big calls again on this particular tour, was very clear about the players that he wanted selected and why he wanted to pick them, and then the style of rugby that he wanted to play.
Absolutely, and I've been privileged to have worked with, some of the, over a 10-year period, some of the top rugby coaches in the world, and some of them are just unbelievable at making the big calls, and others, quite frankly, I found a bit wanting. And, Warren is absolutely at the top of that, and if I could just touch on and just open the bonnet a bit for those people watching and listening, that call in 2013 with Brian O'Driscoll, I think... I remember speaking to them, him and Andy Irvin and Warren, just before they went to the press conference. Were they nervous? Yes, they were. They're only human. But they stuck by the decision, and everybody within the squad, players, management, supported the decision. And yes, Brian was disappointed, but Jonathan Davis was playing the better rugby, or was the better choice deemed appropriate for that particular game and that particular style of game they wanted to play. Just as a side note, I think, on this whole business of being respected as a leader. So Brian, the disappointment came to him the following morning at training, where you talked about all one squad, very clear what the purpose is, everybody supporting, everybody on the page. The following morning, an hour and a half before training, Rallah, who was the kit guy, goes down to training. Brian goes with him, and two buses arrive at training. The front bus has got the test team in it. The back bus has got the dirt trackers, as we call them, as you know. There's Brian handing out a bottle of water, wishing good luck to every single test player as he comes off the bus, having laid out all the training stuff. I mean, that is the mark of real leadership in sport, and what a great example he set all the way to the end.
Yeah, well, I think humility is a characteristic of a leader that is often underestimated in sport or in business, and the other picture there is that of Finlay Calder, who was captain of my tour in 1989, and we lost the first test quite heavily, which was unexpected, because we played very well up to that point. We were undefeated, and we were expected to beat the Wallabies. And we played poorly. And after that test match, Finlay went around some of the senior players and suggested that he might drop himself as captain for the second test, which was very much a defining test match in Brisbane, which we had to win to keep the series alive. And it was, for me, there were two things. One, he was consultative in the approach. Secondly, it showed a huge amount of humility, that he was prepared to sacrifice his place as leader and in the test team for the benefit of the touring party. And interestingly, I think what subsequently happened was that unanimously everyone said, "Don't be so silly. You're outstanding. You're an outstanding leader, an outstanding man, and we want you to lead us into battle," which it was slightly in the second test in Ballymore. But there was no doubt, and I think that gave him a huge amount of confidence. But that humility and that ability to say, well, maybe I've got it wrong, or maybe I'm not the best player, is something which is a real characteristic of leadership, which, to my mind, is often underrated and undervalued.
Indeed, I agree, and it comes back to making sure you've got those lieutenants around you in business, whatever your business might be, and having that wonderful relationship where you're honest with each other, you can trust each other, and you can empower them to do very much, they're part of the bigger picture, but equally you can have those difficult conversations. Why wouldn't you not be collaborative, and why would you not empower? And for me, having worked in sport now for about 15 odd years now, and been lucky to do what I do, the real success that I've seen across various sports has been this collaborative style of leadership. Really has worked well.
Yeah, and I think retaining that clear sense of purpose. So the '89 Lions tour that I was on, never lost sight of that sense of purpose. What are we here to do? We're here to win the Test series. The first time we'd ever toured Australia in its own right. And they subsequently went on to win the World Cup, so they weren't a bad side in that particular environment and era. But totally focused, and I think retaining that sense of purpose, retaining that sense of focus on what you're there to achieve is one of those lessons which is eminently transferable between business and sport.
Particularly when it falls over, particularly when you're up against the door. So here we had forward wind to this year, New Zealand. They were losing games. Pressure was on. Warren's been put forward in the media as a clown. He's still making the big decisions, and the good question is whether or not it was his decision or not to wear the red nose when he went into that media conference. I thought that was a masterstroke. So before we move on to teamwork, are there any questions that have come in, Catherine, on this section?
Yes, hi guys. We've had actually quite a few questions come in, and it's been really interesting learnings about how you stick by being a leader, how you got to stand by what you decide. You talk about being collaborative and using that sort of power of sort of having that power to really drive your team forward. So you've had quite a few questions. You talked about this Lions tour, but somebody wanted to know about what about the Lions tours that you were really on? What sort of leadership skills did you see firsthand when you were with the Lions?
Well, I think if I go back to my tour of 1989, as we talked about earlier, there were a lot of very strong leaders on that tour. So I think nowadays there are more administrative and analysts and coaches.
They're important. They're important. Optimal environment for success, David.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm not disputing that. There are more administrators now than there were players in my day. But we were very fortunate to have some outstanding leaders in key positions in that particular playing group with a huge amount of experience. A number of leaders who either had captained their countries in the past or who went on to captain their countries in the future. But I think the other element of it was the leadership off the field. We had a very small management team. We had a manager, 2 coaches, a doctor and a physio, and that was it. Clive Rowlands was just one of life's most understated, humble and genuine people. And he really understood the ethos and culture of what the Lions tour was about. And that really shone through. We were fortunate to have now Sir Ian McGeechan as the lead coach, and his reputation. He's a Knight of the Realm. That's why he got his knighthood. His reputation as a coach is, I think, unparalleled in world rugby, and has genuine leadership capabilities. Something Guy and I were talking about. Very often great coaches aren't great leaders, and yet someone like Ian McGeechan has that sort of very quiet, softly spoken leadership authority that really pervades through the rest of the squad. So I think it's back to that point around leadership being a team sport.
Yeah, I would say a couple of things, if I may, Catherine, and that is, from what I observed on over 2 tours, where there was real success in leadership was the ability to communicate across the complete squad. These were people who had great communication skills, but also, and this is really important, they had the moral courage to do and say what they thought was the right thing for the greater good of the team. This moral purpose bit, this moral courage to, do you know what, I'm going to front up to the coach, or I'm going to front up to X, and I'm going to say this because that's important. And I think, I've seen examples where that's not happened, and they've not necessarily had the success that they might have otherwise had.
Yeah, and this is fester.
And letting things fester. Yeah. It's that moral courage piece, isn't it? To cut things off early on before things get going. Yeah.
And another question has come through. You talk about making these big calls and sticking by them. How have people, in your experience, made those big calls? Is it a collaborative call, or are they really just sort of making the shots from their gut and what they think is right? How do you make that big call?
I think that's a really good question. I mean, I guess my view would be that it needs to start out with having the right information. You've got to have the right data to hand to inform that decision. And back to the point that Guy was picking up on, the kind of having the moral courage to stand by your convictions and be really clear. I think there is an element of collaboration, because particularly the big calls, you want to make sure that people have bought into it and they understand the rationale for that decision, whatever it is. In 2013, it might have been dropping Brian O'Driscoll from the test team. In business, it might be making another strategic decision. So you want to make sure that you consult it as widely as possible. But at the end of the day, the leader is the one who has to make the decision. The leader is the one who has to make that call, stand by that call, and be held accountable for that decision going forward.
Well, I think those people who have been consulted will fully respect that. As long as they feel that if it's a particular coach from a back, for example, and as long as he or she feels that they've had their opportunities to give their opinion across, completely agree. So you can't have the big call without the collaboration, I think.
And it's one of those paradoxes. If you collaborate too much, you're seen as being indecisive. If you don't collaborate enough, you're seen as being autocratic. So where do you strike that balance? And I think that is one of the challenges that leaders face in any environment. And
of course, let's not forget the very important aspect of having your own trusted advisor, within an organization. It could be a number 2, it could be, if it's in business, it could be a chief operating officer, where you can close the door. So just a quick turn back to my military time. I was working to a commanding officer. We have a very close relationship, and we could close the door and have a conversation, quite frankly. And of course, when the door was open, there was full respect and so on and so forth. But I think having the opportunity to do that in a business is a great thing.
So one question has just come through, and I'm not sure if you know the answer to this, but do you know who Gatland's trusted advisor was?
On this particular tour, no. I could give an opinion, and the opinion would go along the lines of probably Farrell. Actually, I think he really respects Farrell, and I think having a trusted advisor who is at a slight distance, in so much as, so for most of the season, Farrell's been somewhere else with Ireland, for example, and then of course he's working with the Lions, and I know he did a wonderful job. Farrell did a wonderful job in the last tour, and I think my opinion would be that it would be Farrell, but that's an opinion. Nothing more, nothing less. Not right or wrong.
Okay, excellent. Thank you, guys. There were other questions, but we'll save them to the end because I know David and Guy have some more interesting things to share about teamwork. So, guys, I'll let you go on.
Great, thanks, Catherine. I think teamwork is a bit of stating the obvious. It's so critical when you're bringing together a group of players from 4 different countries and trying to unite them behind a single purpose. And I think that is a real challenge and a very easy challenge to underestimate. So I think what the Lions actually achieved in this particular tour to come together so quickly with so little time to prepare and to compete against the All Blacks over 3 tests and level the series at the end of it was really a truly memorable achievement. And you know, I'll hold my hand up. I thought they were going to get thumped in the second test match in Wellington because they were totally outplayed in the first test. So that strength of character really shone through. And for me, the real tests and the stress tests around teams come when they're under significant pressure.
Yes, yes. I'm going to use something here that's not often talked about in this environment, and that I'm going to use the word DNA. And I think, now, you know, if you look at something like the Lions, you are, you know, when Warren has to decide who he has to take on the tour, you know, and we're going to talk about culture in a minute. So he's very clear on what the culture is, and he's then saying to himself, well, if there's a 50-50 call, you know, it's the best of the best, but there's a 50-50 call. I think the next question he's asking himself, and I know this is the case, he's saying, who has the better match to the DNA of what we're all about? What do I mean by that? What I mean is, as you say, players want to play for their country, they want to play for the Lions, and then they want to be a test Lion. Now, if you've got 2 individuals who are you're deciding who you want to bring on tour, you're asking yourself this question. If they are not selected for the test team, are they going to stay on the page and do a Brian O'Driscoll and hand out bottles of water as they come down, or are you going to go off the page, go on the lash, and splinter the group and potentially take people with you? Without naming any names, there are very clear things that have happened in previous tours where that has happened. It has absolutely not happened in the last 2 tours that I've been on, and I've been at the heart of them. And I think the reason for that is because that question's been asked. And I think there'll be listeners out there thinking, oh, I can think of one. And I can certainly think of one, and it's not the right time or place to mention it, but I know one particular player who is a try-making machine. But he wasn't on the tour, and he wasn't on the tour last year, so the last time, and I think the reason for that was because he perhaps would not stay on the page. Yeah. So I think that's important.
And I think these potential fractures and fissures in teams come when you are under pressure. In the 1989 Lions tour, that first test match was a point at which, you know, we came under incredible scrutiny from the Australian press, and I think it's very easy to neglect the amount of pressure that you're under from the domestic press, as some of the Lions this year will have found out in New Zealand. But we came under incredible scrutiny, and we were ridiculed. And we went down to Canberra for a midweek game, and I think your point about being collective and bringing things together from both the midweek team and the Saturday team was exemplified in that particular match. Donald Lennon, you know, a wonderful guy again, Irish captain, was appointed captain of the midweek touring side, but for the majority of the games they did share it, and the team became known as Donald's Donuts. Yeah, I heard that. Which you know, sounds a little bit derogatory, but actually they revelled in that tag. But what really defined it was the Saturday side, as the Saturday side evolved, was just as supportive of the Wednesday side, and the Wednesday match was just as critical to win as the Saturday match. And the mutuality of support in the preparation and the actual playing was incredible. So that back to that really strong sense of purpose and unification. And that midweek game after the first test was really a defining moment for the 89 Lions tour, because we were 18 points down within about 20 minutes. And we ended up rallying and winning by 40-odd points at the end of it. But that set the tone for the next test match, which, as a picture of it, that euphemistically became known as the Battle of Ballymore. It was a fight punctuated by some rugby. But you know, that was the turning point of that tour, and it was that mutual support which really made the difference to the team.
If I could just, from an administrator's point of view, comment on this team pressure bit. So when the pressure's on the players, of course the pressure is on the wider group. And people like me and the wonderful team that I had around me, you know, that's as you say, that's when a system, you know, the system's working. And it's all about, from my perspective, so when you are under the pressure's on, making sure that every single thing is an optimal environment for success. Because if you know yourself, if you let something go, you're giving potentially coaches and players an excuse. And you want no excuses. And if there's no excuses, they can look themselves in the mirror and go, do you know what? We just didn't perform.
Yeah.
We just didn't perform. We can't go to Guy or the team and say, you know, this wasn't right, that wasn't right, you know, whatever it might be. So, you know, and so it comes back to the importance of making sure, and there's a balance, isn't it? There's a balance to be struck. Not going too far, not wiping their bottoms, so to speak, excuse the French, but just making sure there's no excuses and there's a respect both ways piece, and I think that's really important, particularly with all the pressures that's on in the modern day.
Yeah.
Secondly, I would say how to alleviate the pressure. So you talked about going away from between tests 2 and 3. So 2013, we went to Noosa. We were under enormous pressure, 1-1 in the series, to go to Sydney. Why would you go to Sydney where all the pressure is? No, we are going to Noosa. Where's Noosa? We're not telling you. So we head up to Noosa, and it's winter, it's quiet, and the guys have 2 or 3 days away from the pressure, knowing what's coming. And I think that really proved, you know, it's just one of these things. It's all about small things coming together, isn't it? And that was a key factor, I think, in helping win the tour. And this time they went to Queenstown. Yeah. Same thing. Yeah. Got away from it all. All the pressure on this tour after the second test was on New Zealand. Yeah. Thank you very much indeed. Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. So the circus and the head clown went to Queenstown.
Catherine, have we got any questions on teamwork at the moment?
Of course we do. And actually, you just answered one of them, was how do you deal with the pressure? And it sounds like what you do is you have a balanced life and you take a break, you decompress yourself and just kind of get your head in the right mental space. Is that what I'm taking away from that answer?
And I think the other thing is just never losing sight of purpose. You know, why are you there? What are you there to achieve? And you know, retaining a sense of focus on, you know, what your ultimate objectives are.
Yeah.
Okay, excellent. So another question that came through was, you know, it is a great achievement to select the correct team, but you have to make sure you have all the right components of that team. We see that in business every day. You have to have good listeners, good people with facts, good people that can lead or speak, good people that can mingle and network. So when you have all those different players, all those different people, how do you bond them? How do you do team bonding? How do you bring them together to get them to rely on each other towards that greater goal?
Can I answer that question?
Go, Guy.
So we're just touching on something we're going to mention about the culture. So I asked the question of various people in the lead up to the 2013 tour, how best to pool this diverse group of people who has been knocking lumps out of each other 2 months before and in the Six Nations. How do you pull them together and get them to be on the same page? Well, I think there's 2 aspects. If you're going into something where everybody wants to be, like the Lions, and the culture that's associated with that makes a big difference, because everybody, you know, will quickly go in there. But more specifically, actually, and you know, it's transited through what it used to be, maybe in your time, or certainly 10, 15 years ago. You do these sort of, you know, balancing on, you do these team dynamic stuff, balancing on the crate, and you know, you've got the rope for the A-frame across the supposed river. Yeah. You know, those days are gone now. Boys, you know, people are interested in that. Ultimately, what it is, it's doing something together socially. It is as simple as that. And what brought it together, certainly in the 2013 tour, I can't say for New Zealand this year, was when we went to Hong Kong. So we went to Hong Kong, 5 days we had to get, but the first 2 days in Hong Kong, they went out together. They ate together. Some of them may have drunk together, you know, either alcohol or not alcohol. There's no rules. It's big boys. There's a DNA here. We brought you in because we know that you're going to make the right decisions for what the purpose is. And that made a real difference.
I would agree with that. I think particularly on an alliance to alcohol is a great relaxant, shall we say. But I think
not that we're advocating that for the general public out here in the corporate world.
There is a serious point, however, because I think it allows some of the barriers to drop, and it allows you to become more familiar with each of the individuals as human beings. And you know, one of the equations I was reminded of recently is the trust equation. So, you know, in a team environment, you have to have trust. And for me, that is the absolute foundation. So if you can establish trust, you're going to be onto a good start. And trust comes from credibility. Can you deliver? Well, in the Lions Tour, you're picked because there's a track record of your delivery. Are you reliable? So, when you say you're going to do something, do you commit to it? And do you deliver on that time? The third thing is around intimacy. So do people know you? And that's where I think on the Lions Tour, that's socialization, relaxing with a beer or whatever becomes really critical. The denominator and the thing that erodes that is self-interest. So where the ego gets in the way, that then begins to undermine that. And I think that is absolutely relevant in terms of sporting teams or in terms of business teams. And in my experience, the tripwires or the things which are the most significant on that is people don't know their leaders, they don't know their team, so the intimacy factor is diluted, and very often it's all about them. So the self-interest piece is exaggerated, and that undermines trust.
I've got a very interesting story on the intimacy piece, and that's from providing that optimal environment. So, 2005 tour, was a difficult tour, and there was a lot of things which came out of that were perhaps, well, maybe that's not suitable for the modern way of moving the lines forward. So one of the things that we now do, and we're up against it, is we have a team room in the hotel. So it's this intimacy piece. So we've got to make sure that the players in particular, we get the players to take control, we empower them to select their own roommates, and if we need to mix it up, we mix it up appropriately. But also we have a team room. So the team room, so this, just think of a massive room. In there, you've got feeding in one corner, they've got the medical team in another corner, you've got analysis, you've got the Xbox and so on and so forth. And on the 2013 tour, we were sponsored by Microsoft. How lucky were we? So we had the Xboxes, we had the digital platforms, your laptops and so on. And I remember on the first day, and I thought, right, we want to pull people down to the room. So the easy thing to do in this modern day was to send everybody everything by a platform. So they never have to leave their room. And I remember on the first night on tour in Hong Kong, Brian Driscoll comes up to me and says, Guy, why are you not sending all the stuff to us? Why do we have to come down to the room? I said, Brian, it's all about us coming together. If I sent it up to the room, some of the guys who don't need to do any analysis are not struggling medically, they'll never come out of their rooms. But what has to happen is they have to come down, they have to look at the notice board, they have to read what's going on, and suddenly see the table tennis free, table free, suddenly they're playing table tennis, suddenly they're doing Xbox, and it's bringing them together. So inadvertently, we brought them together in a quicker way. These little initiatives that you can do, which made a difference.
Marginal gains.
Marginal gains, my friend.
Catherine,
so one final question that's really come through that's burning, because a couple of people have asked it. It's great if you are managing to have a high-performing team and characteristics of trust and mutual respect, giving people ownership for their own decisions and sort of working together. But what happens when that starts to fall apart, and how do you try to bring it back together again?
I mean, I would echo something that Guy mentioned earlier about moral courage. I think tackling these things early is absolutely critical, and I see it a lot in sport or in business. Little issues are left to fester, and the more little issues are left to fester, the sooner and the quicker they become bigger issues. And the bigger issues are much harder to tackle. So it requires you to have that, as I say, that foundation of trust, so that if you're going to confront someone about something, they're not going to take it personally. Recognizing that it's all in pursuit of what that single goal is, and that goal is far greater than any individual contribution to it. So you need to have that trust. You need to be able to have what you might call constructive conflict or positive disagreement. Have the discussions. Guy, you mentioned about a discussion behind closed doors with your commanding officer, and then when you come out of that office or wherever it is, irrespective of though the fact you might have been rampantly disagreeing, you are absolutely aligned behind that decision, because that decision is for the best of the organisation or the best of the team. And so these sorts of things really contribute to it. But it's tackling those issues around feedback, tackling these issues around performance or behaviours early and early enough so that you can catch them and nip them in the bud, would be my view.
I completely disagree. I simply wrote down open and honest conversations early on. Saying so, echoing what you said. So
yeah. Okay.
Great. And with that, we'll move on to culture, guys.
Well, Guy, I'd like to invite you to tell your story about when you took over and was sort of pulling something together for the 2013 tour to Australia, which ultimately was the second successful tour to Australia. For those of you who can see this, I'm holding up a book that says the British and Irish Lions Tour to Australia, Tour Analysis, 1955 to 2009. And I was fortunate enough when I was given the role that I persuaded the powers that be to give me 3 months to do something that had not been done before, and that was to reach back to former players, be they captains, be they backs, be they forwards, managers, coaches, and ask them a series of questions. Because what I thought what would we do is we do an analysis to find out that surely there must be stuff that's still hugely relevant from 1955 in the modern day, but of course equally there'll be stuff that wasn't relevant. And for those of you who are wondering why 1955, because the rest of them sadly before then had moved off their mortal coils. So I went to them and I asked them a series of questions, and just to share a couple, there was about 8 questions. I'll just run through a couple of them. What makes a winning Lions tour? What went wrong and why? What were the most memorable things from your tour that you felt should not be left out on future tours? And then, funnily enough, in your opinion, what is the best way in which to mould the players in a short period of time into a winning Lions team? And a few other questions. And what I then did was I tape recorded every single conversation. And when you speak to 35, 40 people and you ask them the same question, themes drop out. What we then did was we dropped those themes, and I asked myself the question, who is that particular theme relevant to? Is it the chief executive who's making these strategic decisions commercially? Is it myself who's doing all the planning of everything off the pitch? Or is it the head coach? Or is it the senior players? And we then dropped it into the respective areas. I then gave this book, not my words, the words of the voice of the Lions, to the head coach when he was appointed, Andy Irvin, who was of course the tour manager, and so on. And it just, Gats had been on one tour by that stage with Geach in 2009, and I spoke to Gats afterwards, and he just said, it just helped define his thoughts around the culture, what was still relevant, what perhaps wasn't relevant for the modern day. And I think, it really set the conditions for him selecting the DNA of the players and him starting his journey down, really. So that was an insight, but I think it was a worthwhile exercise, and I think it contributed to setting the foundation for culture. Yeah, I mean, culture, I believe, is so important. I mean, it's the old quote attributed to Peter Drucker, where culture eats strategy for breakfast. But you see in business organisations now the importance of culture, and Uber's a classic example. Who, this organisation which has been held up as the exemplar of a disruptive industry, and yet toxic culture, such that the chief executive's gone, the top 20 executives have gone, and it's now in a state of disarray because of the kind of culture that was pervasive in the organisation. And for me, kind of the language and the leadership of the organisation really defines culture, and I'm sure we can all think of great examples of where the culture has worked really well and where the culture has not worked so well. I think the 2005 Lions tour to New Zealand was culturally a bit of a disaster, and I think it could have been a lot better if they'd just done some simple things well and recognised that Lions is about touring a country and embedding yourself in the country and understanding the culture of the country as much as sharing the culture of the Lions. And I think the 2017 Lions did that exceptionally well. They went to all the Maori points, they went to the Anzac Graves, all of these sorts of things to really understand some of the DNA behind their opponents, as well as being really clear about what their own culture was. So it's absolutely critical. Getting the culture right is such an important part of success for organizations.
And of course, what precludes successful culture is people. Ultimately, everyone has to take responsibility. Everybody is a leader, and everybody has to pull that culture forward and agree to it. You know, and if people are empowered and feel collaborative and feel part of it, you know, the wonderful thing about, and there'll be people listening, so, you know, and they're right. You know, it's not difficult to persuade people to buy into the Lions culture. It really isn't. But I think the lesson from what I talked about at the start was, you need to, on occasions, just make sure that your culture is fit for the modern day. You know, and maybe that's what happened to Uber. You know, who knows? But you know, you've just got to make sure that, you know, because things are moving so quickly and the landscape is moving so quickly. You know, it's worth, is it not, once in a while, just when complacency started to just check your culture, check your purpose. Are we on the right direction?
Absolutely agree.
Yeah.
Catherine, that maybe brings us to an opportunity to have some questions.
Yep, we've had quite a few questions come in there as well. So one question was, what are the key elements to culture? How do you create a successful culture? If somebody was starting from scratch, or if you were starting up a new company or starting up a new team, how would you define the culture of that team?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think if there was an easy answer, we'd all be doing it. For me, it all starts with purpose, and what's the purpose of the organization? So getting really clear about that and making it simple. I mean, the one example I always like to hold up for that is the London 2012 Olympics. The purpose was so simple. It was all about inspiring a generation. And it's simple language, very memorable, and everything was then geared towards it. So if you remember the opening ceremony, so Steve Redgrave came in, and he didn't light the flame, but he passed it to the next generation of potential Olympians. And so that was really important. So clarity of purpose. I think the next piece is around values and getting really clear about what are the desired values that you need in your organization to achieve your purpose and get your purpose right. And back to the point about, do you sit in a darkened room with a towel over your head and come up with a value statement, or do you consult with your organization? My preferred approach, and I think it's something that David Nish did at Standard Life, was to consult as widely as possible in the organization to get consensus around what's important to the people in that organization, again, to help them achieve that purpose. And once you've got clarity around the values and not making it too complicated, keeping it simple, then what behaviors emerge from those values? And once you've defined all that, that's really important. But the key element of that is making sure that that is embedded in the organization. So you've got feedback mechanisms, back to these points around if you don't see the behaviors or if you don't see the values being adhered to, you're calling that out in a way which is supportive and the right way to do it, and making sure that you're reinforcing it.
And having the moral courage to make those big decisions. They're all linked. I would just add one thing, if I may, and I think, you know, when David talks about the purpose, you know, I would say just before that, you've got to have buy-in from everybody. Everyone has, because you're looking to change something that was perhaps in place and not working as a culture, everybody has to buy into it. So therefore, you have to engage with your key influencers and empower them. Feel, again, going back to what we were discussing earlier, you know, they've got to be allowed to feel that they've been part of creating this. And you know, it reminds me of a very wonderful journey I was part of when I first went in as a Scotland team manager in 2004. And you know, we changed the culture that was in place. Through no fault of their own, there was you know, things had just, you know, fallen over a little bit when the game went professional, and there was a bit of catch up. And you know, we then set about going on this wonderful journey of building up a culture for the Scotland team going into the 2007 World Cup in Paris. And the culture, to this day, was one of the best cultures that I have been involved with. And it was all about, from the very start of that, it was the purpose. It was buy-in, and it was very much the question of making sure that the influencers and everybody involved bought into it and linking to your behaviours. And it was a really powerful thing to happen. But they led it, not the leader. It was led from within. That was the key, wasn't it? Led from within. Yeah.
You can't impose these things.
Absolutely not.
What I heard there is clarity of purpose, values, making sure everyone kind of knows about what the culture is and getting key buy-in from people that will then help to spread that culture among other people. The question is, where does this culture actually come from? Does it come from the leader? Does he sort of start the idea, or does it come from the team and it kind of comes between the two of them? How does the idea or the culture, where does it originate?
Do you want to go? I'll go. It's me. My view is that there's got to be vision. Leaders have got to be visionaries and looking ahead and big thinkers. We get all that, and I think there's got to be an idea that is there with the leader at the top potentially, or maybe one of the senior management team. But it is absolutely imperative that it is cascaded down in the early stages in order that people can discuss it. Because somebody somewhere, irrespective of where they sit in the organisation, might have that wonderful blue light moment, and bing, there is the solution.
Yeah.
Would be my take.
Yeah. I'd agree with that, and I think back to that point of people feeling that they've contributed is really important. So, absolutely, the leaders are critical in that process, and I think that once you've defined that culture, the way that they act and behave is key. So if you've defined a culture and suddenly you see the leaders not behaving or acting in that way, that is the quickest way to undermine any culture. Because if it's okay for the leader not to behave in that way, then why should anyone else in their organisation? So the leadership and the language really defines the culture once you've contributed and decided what that is.
This may or may not be the right point to make this point, but let's not forget, in leadership roles, whatever you're doing, you've got to compromise. Everyone's got to compromise at some point. And it might be in this, it might be in something else, but one has to compromise both sides, and I think one should never lose sight of that when looking to change things.
This next question kind of wraps everything up in a weird way. If people don't believe, if people don't agree with the culture that you're trying to set or the examples that you're trying to lead from, do you feel it's unrealistic to think that everyone in your organization is going to kind of march to the same drum, think the same way, and go towards that same goal that you do kind of see on a team? But through leadership, through teamwork, through culture, is it unrealistic to think that you can create that situation in the work world?
I don't believe that. I mean, I think different organisations have different cultures, and the moment you drive into a car park, it'll tell you what the organisation's culture is, because if there's a signpost which says chairman, and then a signpost which says chief executive, and a signpost that says chief operating officer, you can tell pretty quickly it's going to be a hierarchical organisation. And the moment you walk into a reception, the way that the reception is decorated, how you're greeted by the receptionist will tell you so much about that organisation. And I'm fortunate enough to work with a wide variety of different organisations. Everyone is different, and each one's have a different feel, a different look to them, a different sense to them, which for me would suggest that the culture in those organisations is different, because it's all about behaviours, and it's all about the stories that you hear about what it's like to be or to work with or to be a customer of or to be a supplier to different organisations. And so you can absolutely pick up different changes. The one interesting piece you touched on right at the start was what happens if people aren't aligned to it. And my view is you can either change the people or you can change the people. So either you get aligned, you get on board, you engage with that particular culture, or you decide that's not the organisation for you to be a part of.
Yeah, and we're not saying, there are so many different cultures out there that suit different businesses, as you say. And just to top up on that would be, it's really important, I think, all these different areas of a business is to have at least an influence. If you've got a particular area that is particularly difficult to change, with complete confidence that a couple of those influences in that area are on board because they've been involved in the whole process. Due to the size of the organisation, you can't be collaborative with everybody. It's not realistic to bring everybody in from 5 places across the world. But here's something. You've sat down with that person from that organisation who has been brought into the process. They've bought into it. They've been collaborative. They've been empowered. And quite frankly, it's up to them, really, to report back, keep those channels open. And as you say, you can only give people a certain amount of string before you've got to go, do you know what? We've given you plenty of opportunity through due process, HR, and so on and so forth. One perhaps moves on to a culture that they're more aligned to. How about that?
Exactly.
How does that sound? Does that sound quite HR-y?
Sounds perfect.
Thank you very much.
All right. Well, thank you both very much. We are just about out of time. Is there anything else that you guys would like to share with us? Any last messages before we finish up with the WebEx this afternoon?
I would just say one on culture, if I may. And culture is often pinned as being very difficult to change. You know, it's not difficult to change. Where culture where it falls over is people just failing to walk the talk. So one goes through this process and purpose and getting the right people around and empowering people and values and behaviors, but the most critical part is walking the talk. And that's where it falls over. And never underestimate the power of giving people responsibility, custodians, if you like. I mean, ultimately, everyone's a custodian, I get that, but maybe in the early stages of changing a culture, you make it someone's absolute business to keep the thing alive. Yeah. And I think that would be my parting shot on culture, for sure.
Yeah. Great. I'd agree with all that.
Thank you.
Well, I'd just like to thank Guy for joining us.
Thanks, David. I've enjoyed it. It's been good. It's been good.
Real pleasure. And
we're just going to go and swap shirts. But I think he might struggle to fit into mine. Well, it might be the other way around. I'm not sure how it is.
Well, I want to thank you both for joining us and sharing your insights from your past in the sports industry within rugby, and also how you applied that to your businesses today. Everybody on the line with us still, you'll see David and Guy's contact information in front of you, but we'll also be sending out an email. So I know I didn't get through all your questions, but you'll have their contact information. And thank you, David and Guy. I look forward to hopefully hosting you on another WebEx in the future. And thank you everyone for participating.
Everybody for
tuning in. Happy Friday.
Thank you.